Welcome to the Citizens Reporter. I'm your host and editor, Diana Logry. Thank you for tuning in. The Citizens Reporter is a weekly news cablecast brought to you from the Valley Access Studios in Stillwater. Today we are going to continue our report on the meeting that was held January 23rd, 2020. And this is the Policy Advisory Committee for the Rush Line BRT. Bus Rapid Transit. Now the Rush Line is also called the Purple Line. And as you recall, this particular BRT route is scheduled to go from this Union Station in St. Paul, meander through St. Paul to get to the Phelan Parkway, and then from there hook up to the Bruce Vento Trail once it gets to Maplewood. And then it's going to use the Bruce Vento Trail, which is currently used as an ecological greenway and a pedestrian trail. And then once it gets to the Maplewood Mall, it's going to then jut out to Highway 61 and then have a dedicated lane on Highway 61 as it finds its way to White Bear Lake. So we've been covering this particular project extensively. Many of the meetings, almost exclusively all the meetings, are not cablecast, they are not filmed, and the film footage that you see generally on these shows is film footage of ours that we have gone out into the field and that we have been there at the meetings to film the meetings. And today our film footage is exactly that as well. It is film footage that we had our reporter there filming the meeting. Now, where we left off last week on the Citizens Reporter, we were just getting started with the consultant who was starting to talk about the process that is required for such a transportation project that it refers to Section 106. Now, what is the Section 106? Well, it is a historical review of the route and of the area. And so what is a Section 106? Well, Section 106 is a national statute, and it is of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. And it requires that federal agencies evaluate the impacts of federally funded projects on historic properties. Projects go through a process to identify historic properties, assess the potential adverse effects, and establish measures to mitigate those effects or to avoid the effects. So let's start off with our first clip, which, well, coincidentally is the last clip that we ended with our last program, but it will bring us up to date as to where we're at. Let's take a look.
Howard is going to speak to us now on the Section 106 overview of cultural resources. So welcome.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. I have not yet spoken before PAC, so I'm pleased to be in front of you today to talk about cultural resources. I understand that you've learned a few things about Section 106 along the way, but I'm going to give you just a really brief overview in case you have questions. Section 106 is the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. There was a specific section in that act that said federal agencies have to take historic properties into account as they're planning projects. And so that's what is the underlying nature of this study. When we look at historic properties, we're looking at properties that are eligible or actually listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Typically, those properties are going to be around 50 years of age or older, and then they have to be significant in one of four areas. And we often just say A, B, C, and D because we know what we're saying. But A is significant events or trends, the actual history of the property. Criterion B is all about the people associated with the property. So if there's a property that's associated with a significant person, that'd be criterion B. Criterion C is architecture or engineering, things like that. And criterion D is often used for archaeological properties. That's for information potential. So we're looking at architecture and archaeology all along the bus route.
With the Gold Line, which is another BRT route in Ramsey County, that is the BRT route that is running along the frontage road of Freeway 94 from Woodbury to the Union Depot, a similar type of historic assessment had to be completed. And because the Gold Line is further along than the Rush Line, that historic assessment has been finished. Now, with regard to this, looking at whether a property is historical or not, there, as she indicated, there's 4 different criteria that could be applied, and a property only needs to have one of those criteria to apply for it to be a historical property or a potentially historical property that must be considered within this assessment. Let's continue with our next clip.
I threw up the Tran Administration Building here. This is one that's already listed on the National Register. It's not too far off the Phelan Boulevard. It was listed under Criterion A and Criterion C. So we're looking at everything that's already been listed, and then we have survey work happening throughout to find out what other properties are out there. In general, once a undertaking, as the feds like to call it, has been initiated, these are kind of the steps we go through. The first thing is we have to figure out where we're looking. That's called the area of potential effects. We look at direct effects, direct physical effects to properties, as well as visual effects, atmospheric effects, vibration, noise, traffic. So we look at all kinds of effects as part of that area of potential effects. Then we actually do the survey, and that's actually been going on now for a couple years. It started last in 2018 late.
The historical perspective of this route is the entire route. So it's not just properties and certain properties along the Bruce Vento Trail. It's actually the entire railroad bed, because it dates back to way back in the 1800s and historically is one of the oldest rail beds in Minnesota. Let's continue.
Looking at, is something actually going to be physically impacted, or is it just a visual impact, noise, traffic? And if there are any adverse effects, and those are adverse effects are those things that would impact the property's ability to be eligible for listing on the National Register, whatever those significant aspects of the property are. If we have any adverse ones, we resolve them. And that's all done through consultation.
One might think that if it's determined that there are adverse effects, that it might hold up the project. Well, it doesn't necessarily hold up the project. I mean, there may be some delays in trying to determine what the mitigating actions might be, what has to be done in order to change the project a little bit so that it doesn't have an adverse effect on the historical nature of the property that it is associated with, but it's not going to stop the project. Now, this is something that we also found and reported on when it comes to the environmental assessment that is being done with regard to the Rush Line. The environmental assessment, again, it is a required assessment that must be done, but the results of that assessment are not going to stop the project. If it's determined that there are environmental impacts along that trail, impacts to the wildlife, impacts to the watershed, impacts to the greenway, impacts to the surrounding community, a tree canopy, well, that's all noted, and then they have to come up with a plan on how to mitigate those impacts.
Resolution can be avoiding effects. So if there's a way to change the project so that you have absolutely no effect on the historic property, that's obviously the preferred. We also look at minimizing. That happens quite a bit. We're looking at, especially with visual effects, to minimize effects, you can look at how something is designed. the actual specific design details. So in a few cases we have, especially in St. Paul, we have some stations or platforms that are being proposed in historic districts. We'll be looking at the design of those districts to make sure that there's minimal impact.
This concept of adapting the stations so that they fit into the historical perspective of an area is not a new idea. And certainly if you've traveled around in different areas of the country, particularly on the East Coast, you will have seen examples of that. So that these stations and the bus stops or the BRT stops, that they blend into the historical nature of their environment, that they don't just look like they're something from the future when they're actually next to buildings that are, 300 years old. Now, certainly there's other types of impacts that will occur with the Rush Line, because unlike the Richmond, Virginia BRT, where they simply ran the BRT up and down Broad Street, which is an established main thoroughfare similar to our University Avenue here in St. Paul, the Rush Line BRT is going to, for the great majority of its 14 miles, be using the Bruce Vento Trail, where they will have to dig up that trail bed and the rail bed that's underneath it in order to establish the proper foundation for a roadway for the buses to travel on. So it's not that the buses are just going to travel on a little bituminous. That's not what's happening here. They will have to do a total reconstruction of that entire route between the south border of Maplewood to the north border of Maplewood. And so that is going to have not only historical impacts on the trail and this particular historical rail bed, but also contributes significantly to the cost of this BRT. As we reported last week, as part of this BRT route for the Rush Line, because of how they are locating it, they also need to build no less than 3 different overpasses or bridges, which again contribute significantly to the cost of the BRT. Welcome, Mr. Bradley. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Now, this meeting is a meeting that Mr. Bradley had also attended, so you were there when they were talking about the historic nature of the trail and the railroad bed, correct?
Yes, correct.
Yes. And so let's take a look at our next clip as they continue their discussion of this Section 106 assessment.
And then if you can't avoid, if you can't minimize, then you mitigate. And that means make up. Make up for the fact that you have to affect the property. And sometimes that can be done through documentation of the historic resource, whether it's a standing structure, photography and things like that, documented. Archaeology, you'll see excavation coming out of that mitigation. And there's always a component that involves public outreach. So you'll often see interpretive panels or other kinds of things that reach out, let people know what that historic property is and why is it.
That image of the lady that was sitting in the front, that's Sue Vento. She is the representative on the Metropolitan Council, the representative for the Maplewood White Bear Lake area. And so it looks like she's looking pretty intently and listening very intently to this discussion of the Section 106 assessment.
Right, and I would like to put out one observation I had. It was intriguing that because they wanted to go into the poor section of St. Paul where there's a lot of, how should I say, supportive housing, they altered that area because of, if they had followed the original route for the railroad, they would have actually gone off the other side of 35E all the way into St. Paul, right down to the Union Depot. So because of their abandoning that part of it, they said, well, that may be historic, but we're going to overlook that.
Well, there you go, Mr. Bradley. Earlier in the program, we did talk about how the route for the Rush Line BRT, certainly in the part where it's in St. Paul, meanders through St. Paul so that it can find its way to the Johnson Parkway, which doesn't have anything to do with the trail or the railroad bed.
Right. I want to make one other observation. I think that is more marketing to the voters they most expect to be voting for this thing and backing it. I'm a mall supporter, Maplewood Mall, and I am a little bit afraid that it's going to depress in fact, the mall's already a little bit depressed, so I'm wondering what's going to do in the future.
Some of the concerns that law enforcement has is that by connecting the mall and by use of the BRT, that it potentially could increase the amount of crime
Right.
up by the Maplewood Mall, similar to what they've seen at the Mall of America, and connecting that with transportation. Of course, that is one of the drawbacks of having the mass transit. But they really haven't talked about how to address that issue, even though that is a statistic.
Right.
And certainly it's not a reason to stop mass transit, but I think you have to address that concern and that issue, and how are you going to mitigate that, for instance?
And they've already have an example of that in the past in the Phelan Shopping Center that failed for the same exact problems because it was connected to two different housing developments.
Let's take a look at our next clip.
The process involves consultation. There's a lot of people involved in consultation. We have the Federal Transit Administration is our lead federal agency. They're the ones who want to make sure that everything is done according to the regs. They commonly work with the Minnesota Historic Preservation Office. That's the primary point of consultation. The SHPO has a chance to review and comment on everything. We've also extended invitations to Native American tribes. If we have any archaeological properties that might be of significance to Native American tribes, we'll probably invite them again. Thus far, we don't have any in the project area. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation is at the federal level. They'll come in to help us with technical assistance or if there's disputes, things like that. And then these are the two that are most important, I think, for this committee. Local government officials all along the line are part of the consultation process. That also includes historic preservation commissions. So if your community, St. Paul and Maplewood, have heritage preservation commissions.
Mr. Bradley, I had to chuckle a little bit when I heard her say, for those communities that have historic preservation commissions, that those historic preservation commissions also have a voice in this assessment. And she specifically mentioned that Maplewood and St. Paul have historic preservation commissions.
Right.
And yet we know that just only a few months ago, Maplewood was taking efforts to try to disband their Historic Preservation Commission. Not only did they attempt to disband them, but they discontinued giving them any kind of staff support for their meetings, that the city no longer took the minutes for the meetings, the city no longer cable cast the meetings and would not put it on the cable airwaves like they did with all the other commissions. And not only that, they wouldn't even let the members of the Maplewood Historical Preservation Commission, when they were meeting in the City Hall chamber of the council, even have their microphones on during their meeting. And the reason that we know this is because our cameras were at one of their last meetings where they met at the city council chambers at City Hall, and they had no mics, no camera, no staff, and they had to do the minutes themselves. They had to figure out how they were going to continue their programs on their own. But then guess what, Mr. Bradley? Lo and behold, the next month came along, and through either pressure that was exerted or because now Maplewood realizes that they can't just do away with their Historical Preservation Commission, the Historic Preservation Commission now is back on cable.
All right.
And they're being cable cast, and they can turn on their microphones now for their meetings. And they've got a staff liaison who's supposed to make sure that they get their meetings put together and posted on the website for the city website. And now they're back to being in favor once more. But it would look pretty suspicious if here we have this Section 106 assessment to be done for the Rush Line, and then they come to Maplewood and say, well, where's your Historic Preservation Commission? And Maplewood says, oh, well, we just got rid of that 2 months ago.
But I find it still ironic because of the fact is that when we're talking about, they're talking about the area that's run on the railroad tracks, but the whole idea is to abandon that and tear it up. In fact, there's still tracks there.
Yes.
And we're looking at over in the Berkeley Road area that there is a station that's going to be built there. And I assume that if they're going to have parking there and a station there, they're going to have to get rid of the tracks there. They're still in existence. So what I'm really hearing is that this Bus Rapid Transit, BRT, is actually taking out a very instrumental and substantive past history, but more importantly, something for our future too, because of if, as I pointed out many months ago, I was looking at that as the easier, faster, shorter route to connection with Duluth than going through St. Cloud. Save a third of the mileage, save a third of the time.
And not with a BRT, a Bus Rapid Transit,
No.
but with light rail.
Light rail.
That's correct. And so you see, this is where then this whole assessment comes in, because you've pointed out to one particular area that you know of where there are tracks, that it appears that they're going to have to do some major demolition or
Renovation, yes.
reconstruction of the road bed.
Right.
And as this lady indicates, well, that's where they have to figure out then how are they going to mitigate? What are they going to do that if they do have an impact on these historical markers, how are they going to mitigate that? Well, then what they'll do is that they'll just put up some interpretive posters on monuments that you can look at as a tourist or a person at that station that'll tell you about what was here at one time. It's not here anymore, but you can read about it.
Right.
There you go.
Oh, I want to add one other thing. Where that station is going to be, I've taken a look back there. It looks like it used to be wetlands at one time, but of course, because of the way the cities and our government does it, they kind of overlook those things until after the fact. But I imagine they'll have to fill that in to construct that station. So don't say it's a cheap cost, because it looks like it's actually going to have to be filled in and cost us a lot more.
That is an observation, Mr. Bradley, that leads me to another idea, because we know with many of these projects that there's an overrun of costs.
Right.
And if you're telling me that the location that you've observed where you think that the station's going to be constructed is really a low swampy area, a wetlands,
Right.
that to me, not only the filling it in costs and whatever, but that may have an impact on the cost of the footings for that building. Because see, that's what happened with the suburban courthouse in Maplewood. Because where that is, right there by the YMCA Community Center, just a little south of it there, long ago, that was a wetland low area. But when it was acquired through eminent domain by the city of Maplewood, well, then it got kind of cleared out and there was parking lot put there. And so all that historic knowledge of what had really been there was out the window.
Right.
So when Maplewood gave that parcel to Ramsey County to build that suburban courthouse, once they started doing the testing of the ground and the soils in that area, Ramsey County found they were given a piece of land that could not support a building much higher than the building that they've got right now at that location, because if they were going to have a taller building, they would have to have different types of footings because of the type of soil conditions that were there. And so you see, you've brought up a very important point that may also contribute to costs of this project that haven't been calculated into the dollars that they're talking about today.
And that brings me to Toyota. Remember the Toyota, Maplewood Toyota? They had to, even though it was just a parking area, because it was so soft, they had to fill it in more than they expected. Now we're looking at 3 stations actually here that are talking about in this area, the one that's up in White Bear Lake, the one that on Berkeley Road, and then the one that's in Harvest Park. And we don't know what that area is like either. I would like to know how much space they're taking, if they're going to be building a multi-deck parking area, because if there isn't that many people living around it, so I can't see them drive anywhere close to the ridership they're claiming on any of those places. So you need to do multi-deck out in White Bear Lake. You probably have to do it on Berkeley Road, and you have to do it on this Harvest Park area. So I didn't see any plans for multi-deck on there either. So we're talking about costs that they know they're lying on, to me. My opinion. I have to preface it that way.
Well, look, I look at it this way, Mr. Bradley. If Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren can call each other liars, then that means it's fair game for anybody else to call somebody else a liar.
All right.
If they can do it on the national stage, I think people who are just regular folks can have license to do it as well. Well, let's continue with the discussion about this historical assessment.
And we always try to bring the public in too. And that public consultation can happen at meetings like this, or we can set up separate meetings to discuss specific properties or issues along the way.
She indicated that this engagement of the public and these stakeholders and the various agencies and commissions and elected officials, that it can happen like at a meeting, just like the meeting she's given a presentation to, or it can happen in a separate meeting. But what I would like to see them do is that whatever meeting format they have it in, that they have a camera there so they can cable cast it at a later date on the cable channel, on their internet, on the YouTube, so that people of the community can hear what's going on. Because I know, Mr. Bradley, there are many people in our community that are very interested in history. The history of the area, the history of railroads, the history of the pioneers. And so why wouldn't this be a very interesting topic to certainly reach out to the community on?
Well, you got to realize we're paying this insignificant individual a massive amount of money for communications. And if you go to their channel
in Maplewood,
if you go to their channel and try to see what's on it, usually it's information that was taped and dubbed before this group ever took office, and very few informational skits are put on at all.
For something current, that's correct.
Right.
On the Maplewood cable channel, that's
Even
correct.
information from your police force or your fire department, which is also has some very highly paid individuals who don't seem to want to have the public informed either.
Right.
So that's my question is, why are we paying this person as a communications person if he doesn't know how to even handle a camera?
Well, and why isn't he reaching out to committees such as this involved in the Rush Line and saying, we would like to get some of the film footage from your meeting onto our city cable channel, that
Right.
we have blank airspace that we need to fill. Why couldn't he send his camera guy out there? Because they have hired a camera guy who uses the camera. It's the same guy that they were presenting was going to be going to drone training so he could run drones and operate drones for their video purposes. Well, send that guy out there, then he could have it for the Maplewood cable channel.
He's probably taken a 2 or 3 year training course in drones. So maybe that's why we haven't seen him yet.
Let's continue our film footage.
One of our primary cultural resources in this project is Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad Corridor, now known as the Bruce Bento Trail. But this corridor is actually, it's been determined eligible for listing on the National Register. It extends from St. Paul all the way up to Duluth. It is the earliest rail connection between St. Paul and Duluth, and that's where its significance lies. It was completed to White Bear Lake in 1868, and then up to Duluth in 1970. 1870. I have another 1970 coming back in. So it reached Duluth in 1870. It is considered significant all the way through to 1970, which is why I often transpose all my numbers. So we're looking at 100 years of significance.
This points out clearly that this has been in existence a long time.
Right.
And it's my understanding that, like, say for instance, if you collect antiques, something is collectible if it's over 50 years old. Something is an antique if it's over 100 years
Right.
old. Now, maybe they've changed those standards in the last few years. I don't know, because I don't really do antiquing. However, it struck me that the fact that this particular rail bed has been in existence for over 100 years is significant in and of itself. And you're the history buff, so I know that you probably support the fact that we should acknowledge that it is a played a very important part in our history here in Minnesota.
Right, and when you're taking a look at that, another thing to consider is if they took that plot of land and just put the parking on it, and you had the rail go through, the original station is only about 100 feet away from that site.
And what location is that?
That'd be in White Bear Lake. The White Bear Lake station is still in existence. It's in front of a shopping center there, which is a block down from the restaurant that's going to be torn down to build this facility here.
Let's continue.
It's considered eligible under criteria A, C, and D. A, because of that early rail connection. We're also looking at potential significance under A for its connection to White Bear Lake and the tourism industry in White Bear Lake. For C and D, that is really just looking at that very earliest railroad, that 1868, the actual rail bed that the tracks were laying on. That's a very rare thing to have still in existence. And believe it or not, within our area of potential effects, we actually have exposed areas of 1868 roadbed. We also have quite a bit of that 1868 roadbed buried under an 1880s roadbed. That has been altered a few times over the years as the rail industry changed.
And that there are 4 different criteria by which a property might be considered historical. And with regard to this with regard to this rail bed, going back to 1868, it actually falls under 3 of the 4 categories. She indicates A being associated with a historically significant event. And certainly the fact that it is the oldest rail bed going from St. Paul to Duluth, that is definitely a significant historical event. Criterion number C is design or construction type style, or method. And as she indicated, there are some areas that are still visible where you can see that construction of that rail bed. And then D, category D, is the potential to yield important historical or prehistorical information. So that's the criteria D that she didn't get to.
What was the one that was missed, by the way? Just out of
Oh,
curiosity.
yeah. Category B that it didn't fall under is association with the lives of significant persons.
Now hold it. Now I'm confused because I thought that that's one of the railroad tracks that James J. Hill had.
Also, that would be association with the lives of significant persons.
I'd assume so because of he built his empire from the place of Minnesota, and I believe that that was one of his tracks that went north because I used to call it the Northern Pacific route when I was a kid.
Well, Mr. Bradley, maybe you should be on the Historic Preservation Commission.
Maybe I should. It looks like it met all the criteria, not just 3.
Yes, there you are. Okay, well, let's take a look at our next clip.
So like I said, we're looking at the 1868 roadway and later. Grade separation structures are always significant if they're of that period of significance, so if they're between 1870 and 1970. Depots, the White Bear Lake Depot would contribute to this district. Union Depot in St. Paul is slightly outside of the district, and that's a strange railroad history, but the White Bear Lake Depot does contribute. Retaining walls, we have a retaining wall in St. Paul, but not in our project area. And the big thing here is when we're looking at, does it convey the significance, is we're looking at that path. Can you tell that there's a path? So we all know that the tracks are gone, right? But you still know that there's a path there. There's that sense of path, the beginning and the end. And that's what we're looking at.
As you indicated, Mr. Bradley, that White Bear Lake Station is there.
Right.
It certainly has been identified as a historic property, part of this project area. And she indicated how that can be tied into this along with some of the other aspects of the assessment.
Right, and I like the last word she said, path, because of that's very instrumental and important because of we have a path that still follows it, and that's called the Bruce Vento Trail, and we'll be talking about that later on.
And I know what you're looking to tie that into is something that you had received from the AARP,
Right.
Which I find interesting that they are promoting that the Ramsey County Commissioners. Is this like a political sales ad? Or?
I think so, but see, AARP is always trying to interest us seniors, and I definitely am a senior now, into going and being active. So they're trying to tell you to enjoy your city as it is.
Right. Well, and in this particular printout that you have of the message that you received from the AARP, it says Ramsey County Commissioners made your community safer. Okay.
Yep.
Now that certainly sounds to me like a marketing statement.
Of course.
And then it says, thank commissioners for making Ramsey County a safer community designed for people of all ages. And then they continue, Dear Mark, did you know that Ramsey County is a leader in Minnesota when it comes to dedicating funds for walking and biking safety? Each year, Ramsey County commissioners dedicate between 15 to 18% of the transportation budget towards making your streets, sidewalks, trails, intersections, and bikeways safer. My question that I come away with when I read this is the only criteria that the AARP uses in determining if there's a commitment to safety with regard to trails and biking is the amount of the budget? Or do they actually look at how the budget was used and how the trails and bike lanes were made safer.
Right, and then they go on to talk about the parks on this thing later on, which even interests me more because of when you do a BRT, basically you're clear cutting because you need at least a 20 to 30 foot wide swath.
You need that visibility,
Right.
certainly for the bus drivers. When they're going down the BRT route, they need to have that visibility, especially when they're coming up to intersections. That's all going to have to be totally clear cut, even at angles
Right.
to those intersections. So it's not just a straight clear cut down the trail, but once you get to intersections, they're going to have to widen it out like an umbrella so that way you can clearly see what's happening at these intersections.
And it's also going to restrict people's backyards because the fact is they don't want them to be wandering into an area and getting injured from any type of vehicles or things that are on there. So I find it intriguing.
Yes, and certainly when they're looking at this budget that says of the transportation budget towards making streets, sidewalks, trails, and intersections and bikeways safer, are they looking at how much is technically attributed to potential projects like the BRT, the Rush Line, or the Gold Line, for instance? I mean, is that included in these numbers? We don't know because, after all, it is just a political sales ad for the county
Right.
commissioners without really much analysis to it.
And one last thing, for you who haven't seen that video yet, you should watch it because if you are a fan of, I call them the crop circles, as I call them, but they're actually supposed to be circles for merging on and off of traffic.
And now what video is it that you're referring to?
I'm referring to their bus BRT from St. Paul out to White Bear Lake, the one that is being shown to us. I think you have a copy of that. Also, it did show it on the video, but when they were doing the presentation, they showed that they were going to do some of those circles there. And I was mystified because this is only supposed to be 2 lanes. They're supposed to be unimpeded all the way from White Bear Lake to St. Paul.
Okay, so do I understand you correctly? You're saying that part of the BRT route is going to include roundabouts?
Right.
Well, why would they have roundabouts on the BRT route?
That's my question. I was confused as all could be because that was one of the things during the presentation. He showed we've got 2 roundabouts, and this was in the part of St. Paul, up by Capitol Hill. And I did not know why that was there. So I was a little bit confused. If this is supposed to be just 1 lane, 2 lanes, there should be nobody entering in, nobody going out. If it's supposed to be for the bike walk path, why would you need a roundabout on a bike walk path? So I'm very confused on that, but that was part of the presentation. So I was scratching my head.
Well, we'll have to see the film footage on that, and maybe we can bring that forward in our next news program and see if we can all scratch our heads together.
Right.
Let's continue our film footage.
Back up just a little bit as far as the Union Depot and how come that's not, because Rush Line goes from the Union Depot to
Right.
the depot, or beyond, a little beyond the depot in White Bear Lake, so.
Union Depot is listed on the National Register. It is its own thing. It's also part of the Lower Town Historic District. It is outside of the boundary of this district because of the way that the union, or the way that the railroads operated in the 1870s and 80s.
Okay, so it's, I knew it was covered, that's.
It's significant. It's just not specifically part of this district because of the strange way that railroads operated.
Did you see Victoria Reinhardt, the county commissioner
Yes.
for Ramsey County, who represents Maplewood and White Bear Lake? She was very concerned that somehow or other that the Union Depot was not designated as historical as part of this project. But as the consultant indicated, well, the Union Depot is indeed historic, but it's part of a different district.
Right.
It's not part of this historic district. So while the Rush Line is hooking up to and having the Union Depot in St. Paul as being its end, its terminus, it's part of a different historical district. Let's continue with our next clip.
Thank you. Can you tell me, what is the timeline for you to work with Maplewoods Historic Preservation Commission?
I'll
What are
be
we
getting
looking
to
at?
that in just a minute, yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's appointed Mayor Marley Abrams of Maplewood. And you can see that the question number one on her mind is, when are you going to get the Maplewood Historical Preservation Commission involved in this process? Because certainly she had a hand in trying to get them decommissioned. She didn't want to make sure that they had the budget for a staff liaison so that they could have their meeting minutes recorded and posted to the city website, and she didn't want to acknowledge that they were taken off of the air and bring up to the city manager, we got to put them back on the air. Oh no. So here you go, she's asking her question, how are we going, what's the timeline? Well, let's take a look.
First thing that I mentioned was the area of potential effects. That has been delineated finally. I know we're all in the environmental world, thankfully. So that the final area of potential effects will be going to all the consulting parties in January. Later, like hopefully next week. Hopefully. It was the
That would
plan.
be January.
That would be it.
And then the survey and evaluation efforts are still underway. The architecture and history is ongoing. Just so you know, we've surveyed between 700 and 800 standing structures along the corridor.
Yeah, I bet you.
724 of those, the consultants have said, these aren't really significant, we don't need to do additional work on them. That's gone to the preservation office, and the preservation office has already, and to all the consulting parties, and they've all agreed with all, but I think we have 27 that they wanted some more information on. That's pretty good.
So some of this work of the survey has already been done. As you heard, they have already selected nearly 800 or around 800 structures that they looked at to see if they had any kind of historical significance, and it's only about 27 of the ones that they've surveyed that additional information is needed on. And I believe that that list of 27 is available. Now, Mr. Bradley, did they talk about what properties that number, that 27, might involve?
No, in fact, that was part of my problem there was I can, for my own self, know that some of the properties I would be questioning, but the situation was that was just left there because of obviously a short period of time. They basically were just saying, here it is, take it, and remember, the public only had their 3 minutes at the end to bring any type of question up. So as far as they were concerned, they wanted to do a, how should I say, a clear earth type of presentation where here it is, take it, and that's what you're getting. So don't ask any questions, especially at the end, because you only got 3 minutes.
So they did not provide a list then of the
No.
27 properties that they identified that more information was needed.
Right,
okay.
and you got to realize that when we're talking about the 27, that doesn't mean they all are significant because they may have been altered.
Let's continue with our next clip.
Also, as part of the architecture history, there have been about a dozen properties that have been newly identified, never looked at before, and are being evaluated for listing on the National Register. These are ones that we really felt should be fully evaluated. So that's being done. They're also looking to reconfirm eligibility status on some properties. So I mentioned 3M Administration Building is listed on the National Register. There's still something in state databases saying there's a 3M historic district. We all know that district at 3M that no longer exists. So we have to update the records for that. So we're doing that as well. Archaeology, the work is also complete. The report is under review in our office. I mentioned before there's no Native American sites, but they did look at the corridor, the rail line, so that's gonna be in there. They also did some phase 2 evaluations, full evaluations on a couple privy sites associated with the railroad. Archaeologists love privy sites. They do. So those are not eligible. And then I mentioned the LS&M, the Lake Superior Mississippi Railroads.
One of the properties that she specifically identified, although
Right.
she didn't identify much other than that one particular site, is the former 3M administrative building. Now that is located along the Johnson Parkway stretch of the Rush Line. And with regard to that 3M administrative building, I believe that it was constructed as an Art Deco
Right.
design, and it fell under the criteria of Criteria A, which is association with a historically significant event, namely innovation and technology in Minnesota. And that then is one of the properties along that Phelan Parkway that they're going to be looking into more and having more documentation on.
And if you remember any of our old shows, you might remember that before all the tear down on the 3M site, I was trying to make that a historic site itself because that was where 3M really had its creation. And it had a couple of buildings, including Building 20, that I felt should have been saved for its beauty, for its strength, and for its views. And all those things were ignored at that time. So the one thing I have to make the observation is that hang on to your shoes, because the fact is a lot of things are not going to be here once they get done destroying them, because of it's to the benefit of whoever's pushing this project, and it isn't the public.
Right. Now, we are going to conclude our program with showing additional film footage from this meeting so that way you can hear additional concluding remarks regarding the historical assessment under Section 106. Now, before we end our program, Mr. Bradley, I know that you had a couple of news articles there that you wanted to cover.
One that I've been pointing out for a long time, that we should be going off of coal. Now there's a new reason why.
And why is that?
Xcel is getting out of the coal industry because it has to, because of water problems. In Minnesota, water problems? Yes. That is the truth of it. In fact, this is in the business section, that they're considering that for rules and regulations on water usage, they're going to have to abandon one of their coal-fired energy units.
And it says here in this article that Xcel gets actually a red flag from Moody's due to water scarcity, and that water scarcity is forcing the retirement of at least one of these coal plants. And it says particularly that they will have to, Moody's Investors Service says that the consequences of climate change will affect every aspect of an electrical power system, from generation, transmission, and distribution to end user demand. And it will increasingly reflect in the capital investment programs of utilities. So not only is it because there's water scarcity, but because Moody's is going to downgrade the value of the financial investment when you're looking at your stocks and bonds.
I just want to know where they were when it was nuclear, because the fact is we have so many nuclear reactors still out there, and I still feel that they are not as penny cheap as they've been sold for years. Now, one other article I had out here was just a little announcement that Shutterfly is moving its jobs to Minnesota. And that's because of it has a division here in Minnesota that they're going to expand, but they've decided they no longer want to be out west where they originally started.
In California.
Right.
And Mr. Bradley, so are they moving their 100 marketing jobs to Maplewood?
Well, I'd hope so,
No.
but I don't think so.
Are they moving their 100 marketing jobs to St. Paul?
No.
No. Are they moving their 100 marketing jobs to North St. Paul.
I don't think so either.
No, they're moving them to Eden Prairie.
Well, they'll be
Okay.
by the Eden Prairie Mall.
Well, thank you, Mr. Bradley, for being here to help with this week's news program.
Thank you for having me.
And viewers, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you again next week with more news on the Citizens Reporter.
Reports are in draft stages, and we're hoping to get those to consulting parties sometime later this spring. And then what we'll do is, once those are submitted, we'll have a consulting party meeting, so we can kind of talk through everything with the consulting parties as they're putting together their comments. Next comes the assessment of effects. Already mentioned, the LS&M is going to be our primary focus. We have direct physical effects to that. We also look at historic properties near stations and bridges. That's mostly to deal with the visual effects. I bring up this one as an example for you. The Madeline Weaver Elementary School in Maplewood has been recommended eligible for listing on the National Register. And we have that trail prop going straight through here. So we're going to be looking at the bridge there and making sure that it doesn't have an adverse effect on the school. We also have in that area, I mentioned the 1868 remnants. We have two 1868 remnants right by that trail. So that's the sort of things we're looking at for the assessment of effects. Those will be submitted to consulting parties in the summer. And again, we'll have consulting party meetings at that time to kind of talk everything through. We do talk about how to make up for any adverse effects. That'll also happen this summer. And then everything gets put together in a memorandum of agreement. And that's where we write down how we avoided, minimized, or mitigated those adverse effects. And the goal is to have that draft MOA published along with the EA. That's it.
Thank you.
Question?
So Barbara, here's for the question from the mayor, the Heritage Preservation Committee for Maplewood, they're a consulting party?
They are a consulting.
So they'll be invited to the meetings?
Yeah.
As part of the
They will be.
process?
We have the Maplewood HPC and the St. Paul HPC. Will both be invited in. And St. Paul has already expressed concern about station areas in Lower Town District. We're coordinating our consultation with Gold Line on that. But yeah.
So it's the commissions, not the societies?
It's the commissions by right have consulting party status. We have talked to some historical societies along the way, and they can always be part of the conversation as well.
I would hope they would at least be informed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Madam Chair, thank you. One of the things that I've done as a new council member when I go out to township board meetings or to city council meetings is read up whatever I can find out about those entities. And I think the most fascinating part is to read about history. And to the extent that whatever you get from this work that we can build into sharing with the public, both in local publications or by other media, and also in signage and such, will be just, I think, a real, I can just imagine that for Weaver Elementary to be made a historic site is going to be a big deal for that school, and can be a big part of instruction for kids, so this is kind of exciting.
Great, thank you. This is very interesting. Yeah. All right, moving on to schedule update. Andy.
So we wanted to kind of wrap up here and just give you guys a look ahead for what are the key milestones in 2020, and really that first 4 months of 2021 to wrap up this environmental phase. And Councilmember Bentel's last question was very good timing, because one of the things we're doing as part of the Rail Right-of-Way Design Guide is we've been meeting with Barbara's team to see if we can pull some of that history as well